Welcome to Unlimited Parenting, where we discuss everything related to having children with disabilities or special healthcare needs. Today, we'll be listening into Angela, IPL's Executive Director, and Sarah and Melissa, my fellow parent education coordinators, as they discuss their personal experiences with rare disease in honor of Rare Disease Day. So, without further ado, let's jump right into their conversation.
So we were talking about rare disease, February being Rare Disease Month. And Angela, yesterday you mentioned disease and kind of threw that out there. I'm intrigued.
So it's Rare Disease Month, and I was thinking to myself, does my daughter have a disease? Like, is that really the right term? Because I was kind of bothered by it. I was like, what do you mean rare disease? How do I promote that?
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, because she has a genetic disorder. So I went and looked, because yay for Google. So I said, what is the difference between a disease and a disorder? And I was shocked that I learned that they are actually two different things, because it turns out that a disorder is a group of symptoms that disrupts your normal body function, right? Which could be a syndrome,
Sure. Okay.
right?
Yep.
But a disease is so here's the difference. So a disease is a medical condition. The disorder may not have an identifiable cause. A disease does have an identifiable cause, and that's the only difference. So I had no idea that a disease meant that you could identify what was causing it. I guess I always thought of, when you think of disease, you think of something that is communicable, other people can get it, or it's potentially life-threatening, and sometimes our genetic disorders aren't necessarily life-threatening.
Because you said that to me yesterday. You said that that your daughter has a disease, and that would essentially mean that my son, who also has a genetic syndrome, has a disease. And I was like, Gracie, he doesn't have a disease.
Like you can catch it or something.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. So I thought, why is that an outdated term to say that it's Rare Disease Month? But apparently it's not. So
I've never looked at it in that perspective before, because his syndrome is missing. So it's a deletion. So I've thought of a disease as you have something, you've caught something. So very much that.
So tell me, so for others, what is his? And I'll tell you, you share yours, I'll share mine.
Okay, we can do that. So, you guys are going to tell your story. I was thinking about this. We all had a very different, how did we get to genetics, right? So mine was pretty quick. He had a seizure when he was 9 months old. Our neurologist thought he maybe saw something and ordered genetic testing. I didn't have to fight for it. I didn't have to really ask any questions. I didn't have to push. It came back to us, and it came back that he had a deletion on his 15th chromosome. So that told us it was one of two things. It could either be Prader-Willi or it could be Angelman syndrome. So then we did some additional testing. It was called a FISH test that told us that it was, in fact, his maternal copy of his 15th chromosome, a protein called UBE3A that is deleted.
It's amazing how we learn just all these letters, string them together. We are all suddenly biologists.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to be. So I learned that, and I guess I would say, to begin with, the mom guilt hit me because I learned that it was the maternal copy. We all have a paternal and a maternal copy of this UBE3A. And to get like completely in the weeds, the paternal is always silenced, and we use our maternal copy. So for my kiddo who doesn't have a maternal copy, he is pretty heavily impacted. Let's just say that. So I had some mom guilt to begin with, and then I realized that this was before I even existed. It was a deletion. It was it was completely de novo.
Well, that's really interesting and important too, because what you're saying is that it's not hereditary.
Correct. In our case, it was not hereditary.
Yeah. I think a lot of people think that it is automatically hereditary if you have a genetic condition, right? It's like genetic means hereditary, and it doesn't.
Yep. Right. Absolutely.
Do you want to tell?
Yeah, I was going to say, because mine is
hereditary.
hereditary.
Yeah.
So our journey started when I had our youngest, Truman, 14 weeks premature. I had some fluid buildup of my amniotic fluid, and for no reason. This is my third pregnancy normal. I did everything normal. I didn't make bad healthy choices, and just happened. And so doing some research, you get on Google and you're like, why did this happen? What does this mean? And we couldn't really find anything. And then so he has cerebral palsy, rare seizure disorder, and some cardiovascular issues, pulmonary issues, things like that. Feeding. He has one kidney. And so about 13 years later, we were introduced to a study. My neighbor's kiddo has a rare genetic disease condition, and she's on the listserv. And so she came across a study for CP, cerebral palsy. And so I reached out to the company doing the study and test, and we didn't really fit the criteria because he was premature, and that was one of the deciding factors that we couldn't be part of the study, because he had CP because of the brain damage, and so they really were just ruling it out as it was a result of being premature. Okay. So in speaking to the genetic counselors, we were able to kind of go in the back door of the study. They reached out to our insurance company, and they were able to, because of all of the other things that came along with that, able to get us into the study. And when we do those studies as parents trying to find answers for our kids, we run the risk of finding other things that we may not have been prepared for in our own
and we
selves.
have to agree to that. We agree when we
do.
sign those papers, and maybe we don't even realize we're signing those things, but we are saying that yes, because they need to look at us too to see if it is hereditary, right?
Yep.
So
And so we understood the risk, and whatever that comes from, and that kind of just flagged a thought in my mind, and I'll talk about that in a second. But turns out Truman's CP and all the other things were not a genetic, had nothing to do with his genetics and the results, but we did find out that he and I have the BRCA1 mutation, which is the breast cancer mutation, and he had another liver something, but it wasn't a big deal at that time. So he has the mutation for breast cancer, as do I, and that makes a lot of sense because I am a daughter of a mother and aunt, grandmother who had massive stage 4 breast cancer when we discovered my mom's, and so I made a decision. Thank you to breast cancer research and all of the genetic research that is done, to take I'm a previvor is what we're labeled.
Really?
Pre what?
A previvor. So
I
not a
didn't
survivor.
know that.
Yeah, I've never heard that term.
Not a survivor, but a
That's cool.
previvor.
Yeah.
So I made the decision to remove
idea.
my ovaries and
That's really cool.
and then both of my breasts, and so I won't have to. Hopefully, it lessens my risk of getting breast cancer. So I still can, but I have a higher survival rate than women who don't carry the gene.
What does it mean for Truman?
So for Truman, so that's a good question. So for Truman and boys, so my boys actually my other
Because
two.
you have two other
I do.
sons.
So my other two could get tested. And what that means for males is that they can pass on the gene mutation. So when they're doing their own family planning, that can be a conversation. And then they also have to be screened earlier than than what is recommended for prostate cancer and those types of things. So,
But now you know.
yeah. And so without that testing, when women get ovarian cancer, there's no early onset testing for that. You just have it, and that's how you find out you have ovarian cancer. But with this mutation, there's a higher survival rate, and it's really it's the most serious precaution for women who have or males who have that mutation, to remove the ovaries, because those are what are the hormones that cause the sometimes devastating cancer. So, and that also helps me to advocate for my sister, who could now not have to fight to get testing. She can just be tested without question. So,
Wow.
Very cool.
yeah.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I have a different story entirely. I'm back to the non-hereditary, but that's not how we got testing done. So I have my daughter. She wasn't meeting her milestones as a newborn, right? Similar to you, Melissa. Although she didn't have seizures, she just wasn't meeting those early milestones. She wasn't crawling on time. Yeah. She wasn't sitting up on time. We knew pretty early that something was off. Yeah. So my daughter wasn't meeting her milestones, but the difference with me is that I have a first cousin who actually, he has since passed away. We were very close growing up, but he was very similar and in his development with delays and intellectual disabilities. And so very early on, we started to question, is there something going on here that's similar? Yeah. But he had never been diagnosed with anything specific. And but then again, we're the same age, so science really hadn't gotten that far. So we started our journey very early. Probably my daughter Amber was about 4 months when we started that our odyssey, as I call it, our search for a real answer. And actually, we started with potentially that Angelman syndrome diagnosis, and then the testing came back negative. And over the years, finally, she was diagnosed. She was diagnosed with an atypical Rett syndrome diagnosis, but at the time, the gene for that condition wasn't even discovered until she was 3 years old. So we were sort of in the throes of getting that testing done, and then it came back negative, but it was still so new that there really wasn't, all of the pieces weren't there. So there were new tests that came on. It was like, oh, test for this too, to see if it's this reason. And then it was negative and negative and negative. And so over time, by the time she was 10 years old, we had exhausted all of the testing and came to accept that atypical Rett syndrome was her diagnosis. Mm-hmm. It was the closest thing that fit, but we didn't have a real actual reason for it. Sure. And as she got older, she was doing things that most people with Rett syndrome weren't doing, which kept sort of creating a gap that got wider of, okay, she quacks like a duck, but she's not really a duck. Why? What is happening here? So like she was developing verbal language, and that typically isn't happening. There's usually a regression that goes with Rett syndrome that she wasn't experiencing. And so finally in, I think it was 2016 or 2017, thanks to my work, I was able to go to a genetic conference, and it was huge. It was just enormous. There wasn't a breakout session that had less than 1,000 people. I've never been to anything that big. It was so big. But they were talking about the updated science, and they were talking about these gene tracker databases, and that they would put in the symptoms and the genes. So we all have variants, apparently, in our genes, variations that may be causing something, but variations that usually aren't. So most of us will find mutations on our genes that don't really do anything. And that's great, right?
Unless they do.
There are those variants are possibly doing something. So these gene tracker databases will look at, they'll put these variants in, and then maybe another lab in another part of the world even will punch in their person with their symptoms and their variant, and then they'll say, oh, hey, my person has those symptoms and that variant. Maybe we have something that's causing this here. And so they had this one presentation was, I think they had come across like 4 or 5 other kids that had this similar symptoms and the same variant. And that's how they discover essentially a syndrome. The newer with whole exome and whole genome sequencing, now they're able to find that. So I said, we need to find out how we can do this. So the biggest challenge for us is that my daughter by now is an adult, and she is not a priority when it comes to getting into genetics and genetic testing. So how do you justify paying for this kind of genetic testing, which can be expensive? It's gotten a lot less expensive over the last 10 years, but it's still expensive. And insurance companies and Medicaid will still have policies and parameters around who can be tested and paid for and how. Unless you're getting in, like you did, Sarah, to a research study, you know, that's where the challenge lies. So because I have a cousin and potentially something happening that could have been hereditary, we were able to talk about the medical necessity, right? Okay. What is the path for her future as she becomes an adult? What are some things that maybe we need to look at? Like, is there a cancer or a heart condition or any of those kinds of things that we need to look at? And so we were able to say, yes, we can get this paid for. And so we did, but we still sat on a wait list for 2 years because in Idaho, we only have, well, at the time we had 1 state geneticist. Now we have 2. That's exciting. But actually, prior to the 1, we didn't have anybody, right? We had visiting geneticists.
Yeah, that's who I got mine from.
Right, somebody who visited either from Portland or Salt Lake City. They, they would come to Idaho on a rotation and see patients. So we were very fortunate. We got in 2 years later. We did the genetic testing, and in January of 2020, we got her results, and I'll never forget it. I mean, we were 80th approximately in the world, in the whole world, to have this mutation. But it's because other people got that testing, and the whole genome and whole exome sequencing happens now, that we're able to find so many of these rare conditions. And there are those that will say, well, what difference does it make? What, you know, it's a label, it doesn't matter. It has been life-changing for us, and just like you, it was life-changing. You know, you altered your whole life.
As parents, when we have kids, no matter what the situation and what the challenges they have, we're always wanting to know why. Not that it's going to change the way we feel about our kids, but as humans, we want answers to the unknown, right? And so I think that by doing that, it helps us in our brain process the things. And then how do we move forward and educate our families,
that's what I wanted.
Plan of care?
Yeah. I wanted people. I wanted to find other, because while Angelman syndrome is rare, it's not as rare as Amber's. When we got our diagnosis, I think someone told me that maybe we were the 12th in the state, maybe.
Yeah.
So
that's probably correct.
It was probably about correct. Yeah. I had never, and I was told, oh, a lot of them are a lot older. You're the youngest, obviously, because he was a year when we got that. So I just wanted to meet people. I wanted to know what I was going to expect later on in life. I wanted to talk to other parents. And it gave me a preparation for seizures. It gave me a preparation for the sleepless nights that we would be having. So it was knowledge, but it was also a community too. That I know that it didn't change anything. It did
because I know that when we started with that diagnosis, one of the things about Angelman syndrome is that by and large these are nonverbal individuals, and so you're going to look for completely different ways of communication rather than waiting for some sort of verbal language to kick in. And so that changes how you're right. doing your therapies and or you know.
Yeah, because our trajectory absolutely changed. We were doing signs. We were very much starting to get him to, try to, babble. And that was something that he was not going to ever do.
Right.
So it did. It changed our trajectory in terms of our interventions and how that was going to look like for our family. But it also changed that whole family planning dynamic too. We knew that this was yours was not. Yours was hereditary. We knew that ours was not. It was just complete fluke. So we felt okay. However, we also had I didn't have family that had, but I had experienced multiple miscarriages. We have an older child that had some spina bifida. We have stuff going on, so it did propel us to get some extra genetic counseling, and that was helpful. So it did. It changes the trajectory, I guess.
I didn't tell you, so I didn't even say. So my daughter's condition is so rare that it doesn't have a name. Kind of like your BRCA1 gene.
Yeah.
We have a mutation on a gene called the HNRNPH2 gene, which it stands for a whole bunch of things that I can't pronounce, but I can do that in a string of letters, right? So we are that rare, but going back to that whole thing of what are you going to do differently?
Right.
So she's in her early 20s now, right? And it's like, okay, so what are you going to do? Well, it turned out, so think about when we got diagnosed. It was January of 2020.
Yeah.
So in March of 2020, this wild genetic, situation happened involving RNA and, COVID happened, right? But what that did for us in a very strange way is it gave us time, a lot of time to be together because we weren't going in public, right? We were all home. We were quarantined. We're in these, it was a weird time of pain for so many people, but at the same time for us, it was an amazing opportunity for getting to know the community, right? The people, because while there were only about 80 in the world, we have a foundation called the YBRP, Yellow Brick Road Project, and we have a community of people on a Facebook page where we're learning from each other.
Yes.
And so I was learning about interventions that parents of young children were doing and seeing success in using technology that I hadn't even looked at her age over the years. She was out of high school. She was out of school. And so it gave us the ability to realize that Amber could do things that we didn't know she could do. And we learned about a visual impairment called cortical visual impairment, CVI, that we didn't know anything about, which is common in this. And then I was able to go in eventually and do a functional visual assessment on her. And turns out she does have this. We adapted her environment. We did so many things that just increased her learning.
Right.
And so those are the things that it's like, I didn't even know that this was a possibility. And learning doesn't stop.
No.
So what can we do to help increase her independence
Right.
as she continues to get older and keep her healthy and all of those things? There's a lot more to this. But for us, it was truly life altering, and I want to shout that from a rooftop so that if there is somebody out there that says, well, my insurance company won't pay for this, or they say it won't matter, or it's just a label, I want to say that's wrong.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean,
wholeheartedly.
we're not out here trying to take something away from our kids or change our kids or cure them. Especially with that word disease. I'm like, is it curable? I wouldn't change anything other than to provide support, education, and learn how to increase his quality of life.
Yes. We just talked about that this
Right.
morning. That is what I would want from that word cure. And in the Angelman community, it very much is a hot topic. It's a hot word because we have a lot of clinical trials that are in the pipeline right now. That's very
And we
exciting.
do too.
Yeah.
Which is a miracle, right? But and we
so
are.
quick.
But at the end of the day, there are some of these conditions that are very health compromising, and they can be. We have lost children in our community already. We have had kids that have passed away due to the medical complexities of this, and I don't think there's anybody out there that would disagree that, yeah, you want a cure for that.
100%.
Right.
Yes.
I want to cure that. I don't want to change my daughter's personality. I don't want to
Exactly.
change any of those things about her. I want to cure the devastating health impacts that come with so many of these rare diseases.
Yeah, I look at it like if I have a headache, I'm going to take some aspirin. I don't want my headache to stick around forever. I don't want him to have seizures that impact every minute of his life. I don't.
Or you with
right?
your, I mean, nobody wants a cure for cancer. I
Right.
think that might not be true.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
People do want a cure for cancer. So,
But there's other conditions that people are like, well, what's it going to matter? Right.
right.
And
Yeah, there's a lot of that out there, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And also, if somebody is good where they're at, no matter what, that's where they're at, and that's great. That that there's no judgment there for me at all. I'm just, be good where you're at, and wonderful. But there is also, again, like I said, so many of these conditions that there are underlying issues that are truly devastating. And, we want to, I personally believe that even if we are good where we're at, if we can provide more information to the science of all of these conditions, then I feel like we're helping in some way. And I know that at my daughter's age, no matter what is happening scientifically for the clinical trials and the treatments and the cures that may come 5 to 10 years down the line at a gene editing level, she's not a candidate, and that's not even in our that's not something that we're looking forward to. Treatments that could improve her quality of life, like you said, yes, of course. I want her to communicate more. I want her to be able to be more independent. I would love all of that for her. Because when she's frustrated and upset about something and she can't express that, there's nothing worse. But really, we want to be part of the puzzle that can get pieced together to truly advance the science and help us understand all of these conditions better.
Well, I think that's part of being a part of the community too. No matter where you're at in your journey or whatever you want to call it, older parents are giving knowledge to younger parents, and those younger parents are teaching us older parents about technology, about all of these new things. So we all have something to teach one another. I really think that. Because in our community, and I speak obviously about the Angelman community, but there are some angels, and I use that term really loosely because Reese can be the devil as well. But there's
the doctor's name wasn't Dr. Devil.
But it was Dr. Harry Angelman, so that's why we have this. We have angels that are in our community that are 70 years old that are still teaching us.
Yep.
They are still teaching. There is something to be said.
In
In their 70s. She just celebrated her 72nd anniversary or birthday, and she lives in an assisted living home. But she had all of her friends and family around her, and isn't that cool?
Yeah.
It's very
I
cool.
want to see that, and as part of our community, that makes me happy. I know that there are days where it is not unicorns and rainbows, but I want to be able to see that kind of stuff.
it provides hope.
Yeah.
And
You're
I think Amber gives a lot of others hope.
I know she does. for
Well,
your
I'm telling
community.
you, there's a plenty of, now that we're getting more and more diagnosed, and even in our small group, I think we're about nearly around 200 at this point in just, 4 short years. So most though, well, let's talk about that real quick. So, most are doing, they might be doing a lot more. I mean, there's a broad range is what we're finding. There are some kids that are very, very mobile and can run and jump and climb and read at a grade level and speak with verbal communication in ways that I have never heard my daughter speak, and on the other hand, we do have kids that, like I said in the beginning, very very medically complex, kids that are non-verbal, who are not mobile, who are struggling with seizures, who are struggling with feeding and tube fed, and so lots and lots of variation. Even if we have the same gene mutation, so we need to understand that better. But I was going to say, the majority of the kids that are getting diagnosed now with this particular disorder are very young. Because they are getting access to this whole exome sequencing rather than having to go through this, as I said, odyssey of testing. We no longer have to test for this and then test for this and then test for this and then look at this and then maybe it's metabolic and then maybe it's this and then maybe we wait and see for another 5 years, right? Those days are gone.
Yes.
You have access to whole genome, whole exome sequencing. Now, not every condition out there is found through that process, but this one is. And many are. So, but the majority of those kids right now, as I'm watching, are not in the U.S.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, to me, it tells me who is getting access to genetic testing and why.
Yes.
So I've been on my own personal crusade to find out why are people not getting more genetic resources or access here in the U.S. And
I think from that also come the services and interventions for that.
Sure.
In each
right.
area.
What
so
are
different.
those services and where can you access them? And you know, there is a bit of inequity, obviously, in any of this. So I live in an area where I am close to a geneticist. I could get, or, you know, I'm right here in the Boise area. If I live, one of our families amazingly lives in a very rural state, in a very, like 7, 8 hours from anywhere to travel, right? Oh, well, look at our families in Alaska.
Yeah, I mean, they don't.
You know, I mean, so, but this is in the continental U.S. But either way, to travel to see somebody when it's 7, 8 hours, or just for other families here in Idaho, accessing things like early intervention, our infant toddler program, even if you're an hour away and there's nobody that can kind of come to your home or you can't get there, you're going to be behind significantly in either even getting a diagnosis or getting those interventions. And so there's a lot that kind of goes into the big picture of why we might not have a diagnosis or why we might, and then what happens even if you get a diagnosis. So, you know, and then there are catch-all diagnoses like, Sarah, your son has a CP diagnosis, which again, and my cousin who was in his early 50s when he passed, you know, he had an intellectual disability, and that was all that there was ever to diagnose him with, right? Many people, because of spectrum, get an autism diagnosis. And that's as far as it goes. And so if they are a level 3 autism, which it may include not having verbal language and some other things, are they being referred to genetics? And a lot of times they aren't. And for again, a number of reasons. We know that pediatricians sometimes will tell you that they feel that this is out of their scope or out of their wheelhouse, I should say. Like they don't feel, I've read some studies where they say they don't feel like they don't know enough about what to refer to. So they wait for developmental pediatricians to do it.
That was absolutely our case. I knew something was happening. He was our third. Something was different. And I kept telling the pediatrician that. And it wasn't until the seizure that got us to a neurologist, that got us to the specialist, that the I wholeheartedly believe that we would have waited and waited and waited. And it was that seizure that was the catalyst that got us into that specialist. But I agree, our pediatrician was not ever going to make that call.
But sometimes they don't do it because they don't want to refer. This is what somebody told me. A pediatrician actually told me this. They are a little hesitant to refer to a service that might not be paid for.
Oh,
And they
okay.
don't want to put that
True.
burden on a family. So you're grappling with a real, I don't know, I guess that's almost an ethical debate, right?
Absolutely,
Does the
yeah.
family get to make the decision on how they could pay for something or at least try? Is there a way? Anyway.
Like
there's-
dangling the carrot in front of,
there's a
like-
lot of barriers.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
just the end point. There's just
Yep.
a lot of barriers to access for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had my magic wand, it would be to provide access to anybody who wants it. Because
Mm-hmm.
there are always going to be plenty of people who don't.
Right.
Yep. And you don't have to.
No.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
There are others, though, in other states, and not here that I've ever seen, but I have heard from parents in other states that have said, if I get a different diagnosis than what I already
Mm-hmm.
have from a clinical standpoint, like our atypical
Uh-huh.
Rett syndrome, then we might lose our services.
Right.
Because
Yes.
that's qualifying their child.
Yep.
That diagnosis is what's qualifying them for
Yeah.
services. And then something like HNR and PH2, which is so
Yeah.
rare, might not fit into a category
'Cause
that
You're
somebody is saying, yes, that still qualifies you for services.
so messed up.
Right?
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
because autism, CP, those are those catch-all diagnoses
but
that
they will fall into
Fall
a
it-
bucket of, okay, yes, this will potentially help you
Get
be eligible
services.
for certain services.
Yep.
Right.
magic
So,
words. Yep.
magic words.
Eligibility.
Yeah. So, and again, that varies from state to state, and hopefully some of that is changing. Again, as we've made improvements in all of this, but you know, it's time and science, and advocacy. Always advocacy, and always parents.
Does anybody have any parting thoughts or something that they wished parents knew or something that you wish you knew sooner before we go?
I'll start, and then I think that we, in our minds, bodies, and hearts as parents, have a sixth sense and intuition, and to not ignore that as a parent, searching for an answer or just for peace of mind. That listen, and continue to ask questions.
Trust your mom gut or your dad gut, but trust that gut of yours, because we're usually right, even if we don't want to be. I don't think any of us wanted to be.
Yeah.
You know,
No.
I mean,
No, I wanted to be
didn't.
so wrong.
Yeah.
It was the only time I wanted to be wrong.
Right.
But
I
it
know.
really was.
yeah.
Yeah. But
So I think I've already said everything that is parting words. If somebody doesn't know how to access genetic testing and that's something that they want, then hopefully they'll contact us or a parent center in your own state or region.
absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't add anything that we haven't already said. I'm thankful that I had access to it. I'm thankful I didn't ever have to fight for it. And it came to us really easily. I know that that's not normal. So I know I recognize that my privilege in that we got a diagnosis so quick, and then everything started very much falling into place for us.
Thank you so much to everyone out there in podcast land for listening in. If you are in Idaho or planning on moving to Idaho and have any questions on systems or services for children with disabilities, please reach out to us on our website at ipulidaho.org. That's IPUL Idaho.org, or by calling us at 208-342-5884. Until then, this has been Unlimited Parenting.
Thanks for listening.